Hi, this is Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. This podcast is another chapter of At War with Asia. We're reviewing the book by Noam Chomsky, At War with Asia. This is a, American Nazi white gangster, throat-slitting, violent, white American Nazi gangster campaign against the Indochinese people. And today we'll be talking about Cambodia. It's got, large number of information about, the Cambodian, overthrow of the democratic and popular government of Sihanouk, the racist American Nazi white gangsters, what they did to Sihanouk to overthrow him. They invaded Cambodia. They made a genocide against the Vietnamese ethnics. They did, slaughter and ethnic cleansing. This is a group of, throat-slitting white American Nazi gangsters. And that is what they did. They did over and over, just, throat-slitting violence against the Cambodian people, for which they don't care about. They don't, apologize for. They don't pay reparations. They're just, racist, fascist, white frauds, like white, racist, Nazi American, white gangsters, throat-slitting, violent, white gangsters of the United States. And that's what they did. That is all they did. So that is this book. This book will be available on my website. You have to, not on my website, on the YouTube description section. Please go to the YouTube description section and I will have the link for the book placed. There is a second book that I am, including in some of this presentation in terms of, a little more knowledge. If you're interested, it's Against the Crime of Silence, Proceedings of the International War Crimes Tribunal. It's the Russel Tribunal that dealt with the American war crimes, their mass murder campaign, their racist torture, their throat-slitting violence, their evisceration of fingernails, amputations of the Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Laotians people, spinal cord snappings, drownings, fecal water, immersions, all sorts of things the U.S. government planned out and enacted against the poor Indochinese people. So, we're going to be, doing that. That'll also be available on the description section of the video. And we have a lot to do today, so there's going to be very few interruptions. Hope you enjoy it. I'm going to, proceed and begin. So we are talking about Chapter 3, Cambodia, Noam Chomsky's book, At War with Asia. In this chapter, we discuss the deceitful butchers of Nazi American white supremacy and their murder campaign in Vietnam with respect to their white fraud press that peddles lies, fabrications, falsifications, and omissions for the sake of their colonial conquest in Cambodia. This is coupled by their enslavement of the Cambodian people in a vicious system of mass murder and ethnic cleansing of the Vietnamese in this land. The racist American murderous Nazi throat-slitting whites conducted a genocide of the Vietnamese people in Cambodia, using their military right-wing dictatorship of General Lon Nol. The U.S. government Nazi gangsters targeted the ethnic Vietnamese for genocide. They murdered thousands of Vietnamese and created hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese refugees. We also discussed the right-wing dictatorship and the South Vietnam ouster of President Sihanouk, who was the democratic popular leader of Cambodia and was revered by his people. Sihanouk was trying very hard to maintain non-alignment and not be favoring any particular country, to maintain good relations with China and others. The United States would not have this. Sihanouk's social programs, uplifting of the Cambodian people, general promotion of scholarly activity, promotion of Cambodian culture and university scholarship, and a general uplifting of the Cambodian people went against the throat-slitting Nazi American white gangsters who deposed him in a military coup. Despite public revering this nationalist hero, the U.S. government did its standard butchery against the people in an attempt to murder as many and enslave as many Cambodians as possible. The March 18 coup of Sihanouk under the Nazi American throat-slitting gangster Johnson, who, as we know, said, "Fuck you and your democracy" to all democratic leaders of third world countries and whacked all of them good, as he has been quoted as saying to diplomats in multiple sources. Sihanouk was very friendly with China, which the United States murderous, throat-slitting Nazi white gangsters would not allow. They deposed him on March 18, 1967. Sihanouk found economic progress with Chinese influence to be far better for the Cambodian people than the fascist colonial enslavement state that the United States was pushing. The CIA was intricately involved in this coup of Sihanouk, a standard theme throughout U.S. attempts at subversion of democracy and promotion of colonial fascism and butchery. New York Times' Henry Kam, a capitalist media deceitful fraud and deliberate white liar, described the contemptuousness for the Cambodian people because they were against Lon Nol and his anti-Vietnamese campaign, as well as the United States throat-slitting violence that they bring all over the world. It reflects the New York Times' deceitful pro-American fraud media and deliberate lies to promote U.S. mass murder and genocide against third world peoples of Southeast Asia. The United States promoted such instability in Cambodia through their military dictatorships and murder campaigns that a genocide was put forth, which was halted by Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia after the U.S. withdrawal. It is another testament to the American thug action in going somewhere, destroying the country with bombs and murder, and then another party has to come in and extricate the situation that Nazi throat-slitting white Americans created for the indigenous population. The amazing popular revulsion against the American invasion of Cambodia was due to the design to suppress peasant-based movements of national independence. Sihanouk refused to retire to France, and a Viet Cong-backed coup was formed by the Vietnamese peasants to destroy the American presence in Cambodia in Sihanouk's name. The NLF and Khmer Liberation Forces, Pathet Lao, and the North Vietnamese conducted a general Indochina war against the right-wing military dictatorship, colonial fascist governments backed by the United States. The United States conducted a bombing campaign against Cambodia, which resulted in a genocide of the Cambodian people. The United States fails to admit their mass murder in Cambodia, their throat-slitting Nazi-American white gangster military dictatorships, and their grave repression of the people without paying any reparations or giving any apologies. This is the general mark of the throat-slitting white American Nazi gangsters. So we're going to get started. Cambodia. So the invasion of Cambodia by the United States and its Saigon subsidiary comes as no surprise in the light of recent events in Southeast Asia. Since 1968, the United States has steadily escalated the war in Laos, both on the ground as the CIA-sponsored clandestine army swept through the Plain of Jars in late 1969, and from the air. When the report of the Symington Committee on Laos was finally released on April 20th, the Washington Post carried the front page headline, U.S. escalates war in Laos, Hill discloses. The headline was accurate. Other evidence, to which I shall return in the next chapter, shows that the subcommittee hearings seriously understate the scale and the grim effects of the American escalation. This American escalation provoked a response by the Pathet Lao and North Vietnamese, who now control more of Laos than ever before, and led to the devastation and population removal on a vast scale. The destabilizing event in Cambodia, assiduously ignored by President Nixon in his speech of April 30th announcing the American invasion, was the right-wing coup of March 18th, which overthrew Prince Sihanouk and drove him into an alliance with the Cambodian left and the mass popular movements of Laos and Vietnam, which are dominated by left-wing forces. The coup and the events that followed must be understood as a further step in the internationalization of the Vietnam War. However, the coup should also be seen in the context of developments internal to Cambodia over the past several years. These factors are, of course, interrelated. Since early 1964, the United States has been conducting its war in Indochina from sanctuaries scattered from Thailand to Okinawa. The bombardment of Laos, which appears to have begun in May 1964, and the intensive bombardment of North and South Vietnam that followed in February 1965, make use of bases in Thailand, South Vietnam, Okinawa, the Philippines, and Guam, not to speak of the naval units that control the surrounding oceans. the control center for the bombing of North Vietnam and northern Laos and Thailand, presumably at Udorn Air Base. In 1968, the bombing of Laos greatly increased in intensity when aircraft formerly employed against North Vietnam were shifted to the bombardment of Laos. In 1969, the bombing of northern Laos was again greatly intensified as infiltration fell off on the so-called Ho Chi Minh Trail. Most of this area has long been under Pathet Lao control. As a glance at a map makes clear, the bombing of northern Laos takes place in a region far removed from the Ho Chi Minh Trail, quote unquote, and has no direct connection to the war in South Vietnam. It is, in fact, directed against civilian targets and has resulted in almost total destruction of most settled areas and forced evacuation of much of the population. Where people remain, they live, for the most part, in caves and tunnels. According to American embassy figures, the population remaining in the Pathet Lao zones is over 1 million, well over a third of the population of Laos. There may be as many as 750,000 refugees in the government-controlled areas. The planes that attack northern Laos are based in Thailand, where the bombing of southern Laos, including the Ho Chi Minh Trail, originates from Da Nang, Pleiku, and the 7th Fleet. Now the Thai bases are also being used to bomb Cambodia. The American escalation of the war in Laos provoked a response by the communist forces, which now control more of Laos than ever before. Since this result was predictable, the question naturally arises: what was the American government hoping to accomplish by the 1968 to 1969 escalation? Some regard this escalation as merely another major error of the Pentagon and the CIA, but there are grounds for skepticism. The objective of the bombing seems to be to destroy the civil society administered by the Pathet Lao. Quite possibly the United States is pursuing in Laos the dual policy of a massive destruction in areas that are beyond the reach of American-controlled armies and removal of population to refugee camps and urban slums whenever this is feasible. This has been the effect of the American escalation, and is likely that it was the intended effect, as in Vietnam. To facilitate the all-weather bombardment of North Vietnam, advanced navigational facilities were established in northern Laos. One of these, at Phuoc Pha Thi, became known to the American public when it was overrun on March 11, 1968. It was 17 miles from the border of North Vietnam on a mountain peak. There were American casualties, but the number remains classified. The base had been established in 1966. Other such facilities were established, but information is classified. The CIA has also endeavored to maintain guerrilla bases in these territories, long administered by the Pathet Lao. The United States has also employed extensive mercenary forces. The term is precise, from South Korea, Thailand, and the Philippines, as well as Chinese and Cambodian mercenaries. The number of these forces taken together with the troops from Australia and New Zealand over the years has been about the same as that of the North Vietnamese, claimed by the Americans to be in South Vietnam. Of course, all of these forces and their firepower are quite small as compared to the American occupying army, even apart from the Pacific Naval and Air Command operating from its privileged sanctuaries. During the 1960s, Prince Sihanouk tried with much success to save Cambodia from the spreading Indochina War. Nevertheless, the war has spilled over into eastern Cambodia. Those whose information is restricted in American government propaganda may have visions of an invasion of Cambodia by great North Vietnamese armies. The truth is rather different. As American ground sweeps and aerial bombardment devastated much of the Vietnamese countryside, Vietnamese resistant forces have taken refuge in sparsely inhabited areas of eastern Cambodia, which have increasingly been used as rest and recreation areas and conceivably command posts. At the same time, the armed forces of the United States and its allies and collaborators have carried out substantial military attacks against Cambodia. Evidence is meager, but what there is supports these general conclusions. The earlier stages are described as follows by the British scholar Michael Leifer. From the early 1960s, charges had been leveled from Saigon and later from Washington that Cambodian territory was being used as an active sanctuary for Viet Cong insurgents. Prince Sihanouk had denied the charges consistently, and the denials had always been sustained as a result of inquiries by the International Control Commission for Cambodia, by Western journalists, and even by Western military attachés stationed in Phnom Penh. In July 1966, an American study team investigated specific charges by the United States government on the scene and found them to be entirely without substance. However, the team happened to be present immediately after an American helicopter attack on the Cambodian village of Phlok Trak, and its published report, relying on information supplied by Cambodian officials, also mentions other specific attacks on villages. The Phlok Trak attack was at first denied by the United States, but was then conceded since eyewitnesses, including a CBS television team, were present. This, incidentally, is the usual pattern. To cite only the most recent case, the bombing of North Vietnam on May 1st, 1970, was admitted by the United States government, but it appears only after a report was filed by an American newsman, Robert Boyd, who happened to be present near the site of the bombing. The Cambodians report many other such incidents. For example, on February 24, 1967, a large number of armed force elements consisting of Americans, South Vietnamese, and South Koreans entered Cambodian territory and fired heavily on the Khmer defenders of the village of Duan Roth. On the same day, aircraft of the same armed forces heavily bombed the Khmer village of Krak Kran, which was then invaded and burnt by the United States South Vietnamese troops who occupied the village until March 3rd. According to official Cambodian statistics, up to May 1969, the United States and its allies were responsible for 1,864 border violations, 165 sea violations, 5,149 air violations, 293 Cambodian deaths, and 690 Cambodian wounded. In review of the events of 1967, Roger Smith writes that the relations between Cambodia and the United States were strained because of periodic South Vietnamese and American bombing of Cambodian villages along the South Vietnamese frontier, armed incursions from Thailand, and late in the year, a reported South Vietnamese imposed blockade of shipping to Phnom Penh via the Mekong River, close quotes. Additional problems were caused by the activities of the Khmer Saray, Free Khmers, which in the beginning of 1966 declared war on Cambodia and claimed responsibility for incursions across the border. The Khmer Saray are reported to be led by an adventurer named Song Sak, who fled Cambodia by bribing a pilot of an aviation club, taking with him all its funds, and the fascist, quote-unquote, Song Ngok Than, who was the head of Cambodian government under the Japanese after spending most of World War II in Tokyo, and later switched his allegiance to the CIA, not an unfamiliar pattern. This group is made up of Cambodians who were trained by the American Special Forces in South Vietnam and have carried out operations against Cambodia from bases in South Vietnam and Thailand. We shall return to this interesting organization and its recent activities in a moment. The Cambodian government white paper of January 1970, C-Note 8, covers events up to until May 1969. Since then, there have been many further incidents. The American biologist Arthur Westing, who was investigating American defoliation in Cambodia, C-Note 8, inspected the site of one such incident shortly after it occurred last November. He describes this as a particularly vicious case. A village was attacked and houses a school, livestock, a hospital marked with giant red cross on its roof, and a well-marked ambulance trying to retrieve wounded were all destroyed by bombs, rockets, and napalm. The ICC reported no evidence of the presence of Viet Cong, nor would the United States produce any photographic or other evidence, despite daily reconnaissance flights. The United States charge suggested that our pilots must have lost their cool, quote unquote, for about 48 hours. Westing speculates that the attack may have been a punitive or retaliatory measure following the destruction of a United States helicopter last October 24th, and particularly of a U.S. F-105 on November 14th, both shot down in the course of attacking Dak Dam in casual and callous disregard of Cambodian neutrality. The American government apologized and paid $11,400 in reparations. I shall return below to other recent incidents reported by Americans present at the scene. As in the case of Laos, it may be asked what the United States hoped to achieve by these repeated attacks in Cambodia, in which, so far as we know, no Viet Cong or North Vietnamese was ever killed and no damage was done to any Vietnamese military site. Again, it is possible that, quote, faulty intelligence is to blame, I suspect. However, that the aerial, naval, and ground attacks were for the most part capricious or vengeful, as appears to have been the case in the incidents that Westing reported. The American military does not recognize the right of others to defend their own territory from American attack or overflight, or to interfere with American plans by inhabiting areas that the United States government, racist white frauds, feels should be cratered or defoliated. And when such people aggressively insist on these rights, the United States racist, white, Nazi, throat-slitting gangster authorities feel free to react as they choose. Where we have evidence at all, it appears that the American attacks on Cambodia were governed by such assumptions, though it is possible that in some cases it was believed, apparently falsely, that Vietnamese military targets were being attacked. A European resident of Phnom Penh described to a reporter a visit before the recent coup to Svai Reng town in the Parrots Beak area, 5 kilometers from the closest border point. During lunch, an American plane came over and looped the loop over the governor's house. The plane kept diving at a Cambodian flag, which was flying in the front garden. A policeman took out his pistol and fired a few shots at the plane. I suppose if he had hit it, the Americans would have come in and napalmed the whole town. An exaggeration or a joke, ? One can hardly say so, given what evidence we have regarding American military actions. Very likely something of the sort accounts for many, perhaps most, of the attacks on Cambodia. The first attested case of a Viet Cong installation within Cambodia was in November 1967, when American journalists claimed to have found a Viet Cong campsite 4 miles within Cambodian territory. Since that time, Viet Cong and NVA forces have taken refuge in eastern Cambodia after intensive bombardment and American ground sweeps in South Vietnam, using these territories much as the United States makes use of Thailand, Vietnam, the Philippines, Taiwan, Japan, Okinawa, Guam, Hawaii, and oceans of Asia and the Pacific. The analogy is, of course, inexact, since the Vietnamese obviously do not dispose of anything like the resources that the United States employs for its war against the people of Vietnam, Laos, and now Cambodia. T.D. Allman, one of the most knowledgeable and enterprising of the American correspondents now in Cambodia, describes the situation as follows. Although tens of thousands of Vietnamese communist troops have been for long on Cambodian soil, they have been lying low in the border regions and causing little trouble. The arrangement has meant the presence of foreign troops on Cambodian soil, but it has also allowed Cambodia, alone among its neighbors, to pass through the dangers of the Vietnam War without having its countryside ravaged and its population brutalized. I will not take the space to comment on the hypocrisy of the reference to quote-unquote sanctuaries by the American government and its propagandists, frauds, and liars and apologists. Perhaps the most appropriate remark in this connection was made by Prince Sihanouk after the coup. The cynicism of the United States exclusive reached its peak when he demanded that the resistance forces of our 3 peoples, i.e. of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, evacuate their own countries in response to the withdrawal of a part of the United States forces, and especially when our resistance has become, quote, foreign intervention on our own soil. Where then should our liberation armies go To the United States, question mark? Sihanouk is quite correct when President Nixon refers to the lack of sincerity on the part of the North Vietnamese, an expression now used by American propaganda as a cover term for Cambodians, Laotians, South Vietnamese, and North Vietnamese who obstinately refuse to obey American orders in Laos, Cambodia, and South Vietnam, to their continued aggression in the face of American withdrawals, which now leave in South Vietnam a force considerably larger than the entire North Vietnamese army. The meaning of his words is, plainly, that these aggressors have refused to surrender to the right-wing government's military dictatorships that the United States has installed and the native military forces that it organizes, trains, supplies, pays, and advises. With equal justice, Hitler might have spoken of the aggressiveness of the French Maquis, who were, of course, supplied and advised by the Anglo-Saxons, and Toho of the lack of sincerity of the Chinese bandits, who refused to accept the rule of Wang Ching-wei, whom the Japanese installed as a puppet ruler in 1940. But Wang Ching-wei had at least been a leading Chinese nationalist, not a General Thu, nor did the Germans deploy an expeditionary force on anything remotely approaching the American scale to ensure the rule of the Vichy government. It cannot be stressed too strongly that what is remarkable about the Indochina War is the inability of the American invaders to establish indigenous governments that can rule effectively and control their societies with their own means. In this respect, the United States in Indochina still falls far short of its distinguished predecessors, though the American White House easily matches them in cynicism and mendacity and surpasses all competitors in its reliance on violence and terror. So that's section one. I'm going to make just a couple comments. So you can see, the U.S. government, just mass murder bombing campaigns of Cambodia. They just, shot, missiles and bombs into Palm. The peasants were, submitted into fear. These are, racist Nazi American white throat-slitting gangsters. The cynicism of the United States. Prince Sihanouk made his own comment. Where is the liberation armies to go if you want us to withdraw from our own territory? To the United States? Are you going to accept Sihanouk and the Cambodian people? These are racist American white, Nazi throat-slitting white gangsters. And in addition to that, there was one more comment. In that the planes, were bombing from Thailand. The planes were bombing northern Laos from Thailand. They were, bombing from Thailand. All of the propaganda, all of the media was propaganda fraud. They had a helicopter that was attacked, and then, they said that Cambodia is being used as a sanctuary site. Vietnam was using Cambodia as a sanctuary site. All lies, all peddled lies. The standard deceitful fraud liars of the U.S. government, racist white, Nazi American, throat-slitting white gangsters. So continuing section 2. To return to Cambodia, the country was then partially drawn into the Indochina War, though Prince Sihanouk managed to maintain neutrality by a delicate balancing act and to save it from the terror that ravaged Vietnam and Laos. The contrast between Cambodia and its immediate neighbors was described by T.D. Allman just a few months ago as follows. A few days later, in a commercial plane, I flew over Svay Rieng province. From the air, the frontier is now clearly defined. Beyond the Parrots Beak Peninsula of neat Cambodian rice fields and villages, the land is pitted by literally hundreds of thousands of bomb and shell craters. In some cases, the year of day and night bombing have changed the contours of the land, and little streams form into lakes as they fill up mile after square mile of craters. Above this desolation and along and just across the Cambodian frontier, the American helicopters and planes whirl continuously, firing their guns and cannons, dropping their bombs. The March 18th coup against Sihanouk marked the end of this period of fairly effective neutrality. It is safe to predict that the frontier will no longer be so clearly defined. Evidently, it was the coup of March 18th that destabilized the Cambodian situation. It created an entirely new situation within Cambodia and may also prove to have affected significantly the long-term relations among the peoples of Indochina. Cambodia, like the other states of the region, is a melange of ethnic groups. The large majority of its population, of about 7 million, is Khmer. The term is often used as synonymous with quote unquote Cambodian. But there are substantial Chinese and Vietnamese minorities of perhaps about 500,000 each, in addition to mountain tribes. Many Vietnamese were brought to Cambodia, as to Laos, by the French to work the rubber plantations in Laos and the mines, but also to serve as administrators for the colonial government and private businesses. They also succeeded in taking over a large share of local commerce. The French capitalized on feelings of inferiority toward the Vietnamese among the native Khmer and Lao, and by so doing, no doubt intensified these feelings, which remain an important factor in current politics. They adopted the standard colonialist policy of using minorities or outsiders to help control native populations. Jean Lecoutre describes the French colonial system as one of, quote, double domination, that of the French administration over 3 Vietnamese regions, and that of the Vietnamese cadres over the 2 small countries of the West, Laos and Cambodia. The French scholar Jean Chesnaw writes, if the popular movements of Cambodia were repressed by Annamite riflemen, it was the Cambodian riflemen who were brought in to restore order among the Vietnamese of the lower Mekong. The Americans do much the same, relying on Khmer mercenaries in South Vietnam, see Note 31, and using the Saigon army to restore order in Cambodia. At the same time, there is a Khmer minority of about 700,000 in the western part of South Vietnam. According to Chesneau, the Khmer minority, oppressed by Saigon policies of racial discrimination, gave massive support to the NLF. He also reports that the Khmer peasants in Cambodia took no part in the recent pogroms initiated by the Lon Nol government against the Vietnamese minority in Cambodia. Such observations suggest that there has always been a possibility of peaceful cooperation among the peoples of Indochina, the Viet, the Lao, the Khmer, the Chinese, and the mountain tribesmen, if the Western imperialists, whose presence has exacerbated all potential conflicts, were to depart. It is interesting in this connection that the 1962 Congress of the NLF of South Vietnam called for a neutralist bloc, including South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The United States, hoping to convert South Vietnam into a permanent base for its colonial operation, showed no interest in the idea, if indeed it even took official notice of it. In 1965, Prince Sihanouk convened a conference of the Indochinese people in Phnom Penh. It brought together representatives of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, North Vietnam, the NLF of South Vietnam, the Pathet Lao, the ruling Sangkum Party of Cambodia, and other South Vietnamese opposed to American hegemony. It was able to achieve very little, coming as it did immediately after the initiation of the intensive and regular bombardment of South and North Vietnam in early February 1965. As the Vietnam War expanded, tensions began to develop between Sihanouk and the Viet Cong. Sihanouk's press began to speak of Viet Cong support for the small local guerrilla groups, the so-called Red Khmer or Khmer Viet Minh. T.D. Allman, reviewing these developments just a few months ago, described the conflicts as more potential than real, if only because Sihanouk's enormous popularity continues undiminished in the countryside. Immediately after the March 18 coup, the leadership of the Red Khmers approached Sihanouk and offered to join him in opposition to American imperialism. Sihanouk accepted this offer and called for guerrilla war. In his speech to the closing session of the April 1970 Summit Conference of Indochinese Peoples in China, Sihanouk said that United States imperialist aggression has created a new unity among the peoples of Indochina. Quote, the process of union and cooperation is in the line of history in the same way as decolonization and liberation of oppressed peoples in the Third World. Only yesterday, the colonial powers divided these peoples in order to quote-unquote rule them, and they did not accept decolonization until forced to do so by armed resistance. Today, the old colonialists have been replaced by imperialist and neo-fascist colonialists, and there is no hope through diplomacy, negotiations, conferences, or even friendly neutrality of avoiding the mortal danger that they represent. Wherever this danger appears, armed struggle alone is the only way to eliminate it. I'm going to read that last sentence again. Today, the old colonists have been replaced by imperialists and neo-colonists. And there is no hope through diplomacy, negotiations, conferences, or even friendly neutrality of avoiding the mortal danger that they represent. Wherever this danger appears, armed struggle alone is the only way to eliminate it. His closing words were, "Long live the united peoples of Indochina." Whether real unity among the Indo-Chinese people will be achieved remains to be seen. Some of the best informed observers are optimistic in this regard. Jean Chiznu writes, "The history of Viet-Lao-Khmer relations has not bequeathed these people a burden of territorial conflicts. The frontiers fixed by colonization have not been placed in question. The moral relations among them are also disentangled from the friction of the past. Cambodia today is plunged directly into the war by an external initiative, the promoters of which doubtless did not gauge all of the consequences, in particular the development of solidarity among the Vietnamese, Laotians, and Cambodians." In the past, Sihanouk hoped with much reason that China would, in the long run, be the guarantor of Cambodian neutrality against possible Vietnamese incursions. China has no reason to want a powerful bloc of unified states to its south, controlled either from the outside or by one dominant member, any more than the USSR of the post-war world looked for a favor on a Balkan alliance dominated by Tito. Hence, it is opposed to American domination of Indochina, as it would no doubt oppose Thai or Vietnamese domination, were either to appear likely. American propaganda naturally insists that China hopes to rule the region itself, or to do so through its quote-unquote puppets in Hanoi. But these claims are supported by no evidence or serious argument. Sihanouk, though himself strongly anti-communist in the past, appears to have had faith in China's intentions, in part for the general reasons just mentioned, but in part because of China's attitude since this regime was established. Michael Feld comments, as he, Sihanouk, frequently remarks, China has behaved in an exemplary fashion towards Cambodia. Its independence and territorial integrity have been harassed, not by the Chinese colossus, but by South Vietnam and Thailand, camp followers of the United States of America. Now, of course, Sihanouk has formed a direct alliance with the Cambodian left and with China. It remains to be seen how the situation will develop under these changed circumstances, though it would appear that China's long-term goals should remain unaltered even after Cambodia's most popular political personality, the formerly anti-communist spokesman for Cambodian nationalism, has been driven into an alliance with the communists. The immediate background for the Cambodian coup of March 18th is described as follows by T.D. Allman. The underlying cause for Sihanouk's fall probably lay in the fact that although he revolutionized Cambodia's foreign policy and his own relations with the peasants and workers, he left the traditional Khmer elite free to occupy office and eventually use their traditional power against him. The report notes that the common people continued to revere Sihanouk, but a tiny minority brought him down. However, the new rulers, as they busy themselves taking back in power and financial opportunities what Sihanouk took away from them, doubtlessly will have much harder time retaining the loyalty of the countryside, where all real Asian revolutions begin and are won. By biting off the hand which fed them, the tiny group of aristocrats, army officers, and businessmen which toppled Sihanouk may have ensured its own doom. The coup, Allman writes elsewhere, was not only short-sighted in that it upset the delicate balance that Sihanouk had maintained, but also selfish. The main complaint of the tiny elite that staged the coup is that Sihanouk had deprived the aristocracy the bourgeoisie and the army of their traditional slice of the financial action and of their accustomed place in the sun. It was an upper-class coup, not a revolution. The fact must be appreciated. It goes a long way toward explaining the American invasion of Cambodia. The March 18th coup was a culmination of a carefully prepared series of actions taken over the past several years that slowly eroded the position of the Cambodian left, tenuous at best, within the government. In the elections of 1966, Sihanouk departed from his usual practice of endorsing candidates. Under the conditions of Cambodian society, the result was a general victory for the most corrupt and the wealthiest candidates, those who could freely distribute bribes, patronage, and promises. As Jean Lecruder put it, commerce society received the kind of representation manipulated by money and feudal conditions, which was natural to it in this period of history. The only exceptions were three left-wing delegates, Hu Nim, Hu Yuan, and Q Sampan, who won easily. At the time, Sihanouk was warned by the leftist minister Chang Sang that a right-wing coup led by Lon Nol might be in preparation. But he apparently felt that he could keep the right under control, relying on the loyalty and support of the people. Step by step, he succumbed to right-wing pressures that were directed as much against his economic reforms as against his personal power, with its extensive and unique popular base among the peasantry and the small urban proletariat. By the end of 1969, much of Sihanouk's commerce socialism had been dismantled, and the few left-wing members of the government had been removed. To a large extent, these developments must be seen as an internal struggle for power among the Cambodian elite. While this shift to the right was taking place within the government, the radical left took on a more activist policy in the elites, with demonstrations and popular agitations, and rebel groups are formed in rural areas. The intensification of the Vietnam War, with the spillover into Cambodia, also served to increase the polarization within Cambodia that was held in check by Sihanouk's personal popular strength. Several months before the coup, members of the Commissariat began crossing into Cambodia and, quote, rallying to the Cambodian army with their arms and equipment. In retrospect, it appears that the Commissariat have been a Trojan horse infiltrated in the Cambodian forces, perhaps by the CIA, to stiffen the right-wing elements that were readying the anti-Sihanouk coup. On March 4th, General Lon Nol, then president of the Council of Ministers and Minister of Defense, took on, in addition, the post of Minister of Information, thereby gaining control of the press, radio, and television. A few days later, the army organized anti-Vietnamese demonstrations in Svay Rieng province and staged demonstrations in Phnom Penh, where soldiers in civilian dress sacked the PRG and DRV embassies. Sihanouk, who was visiting Paris, noted the rising threat to his rule, and he commented, "If I do not obtain satisfaction that the communists will respect Cambodia's neutrality, then I will resign. A showdown between the extreme right wing and myself is most probable." He went on to speak of the possibility of a coup d'etat, led perhaps by General Lon Nol. He observed that many officers are naturally right-wing and are nostalgic about American aid, which would enable them to lead an easy life. The Americans are inside the castle walls, that is, inside our homes. He expressed certainty that right-wing leaders in the government were in contact with the United States, whether through the embassy, the CIA, or any such like organization. I do not know. On March 18th, the coup took place, led by General Lon Nol and Sirik Matak, a tiny Cambodian elite hoping to win for itself a larger share of control in the economy and political life, and resentful of Sihanouk's personal authority and prestige, plunged the country into civil war and set the stage for the American invasion that now threatens to turn Cambodia into another Laos or Vietnam. The role of outside governments in the March 18th coup can only be guessed and will probably never be known in any detail. Most observers take for granted that the Americans played a role. Chisnu, for example, states that the taking of power by the Lon Nol group is the result of a long series of attempts by the Cambodian right, supported by the United States. As already noted, the actions of the Commissariat provide evidence for this view. The role of the French government is also open to some speculation. There are those who feel that the French government may have been directly implicated in the coup. Certainly, it gave little support to Sihanouk when the coup took place. Jean Lecoutre describes the behavior of the French government as follows. It now seems established that Prince Sihanouk, upon learning from the Lon Nol coup, telephoned directly to the Élysée, where 6 days earlier he had been the guest of M. Pompidou, to determine whether Paris would support him. If assurance would have been given him, he would have attempted, come what may, to land the next day in Phnom Penh. The response was so evasive, we have been told, that the prince turned towards Moscow and Peking. One might judge that this was one of the moments when elimination of General de Gaulle has played a role in international politics. Elsewhere, Lecoutre notes that in private circles, many Vietnamese and Khmers who support Prince Sihanouk are asking if one must not see in this, quote, neutrality of France face to face with the destruction of the policy of neutrality, one of the results of M. Pompidou's trip to the United States. An interesting speculation indeed. Immediately after the coup, pro-Sihanouk demonstrations broke out in many places. About 80 to 100 Cambodians, all unarmed, were killed in the repression of the demonstrations. Significantly, notes Alman, no Vietnamese were killed. Jean-Claude Pamanti of Le Monde responses, repression of pro-Sihanouk demonstrators among the peasants toward the end of March in the wake of the coup could only have served to swell the small bands of insurgents generally referred to rightly or wrongly as, quote, red Khmers. Many peasants, fearful of arrest after the demonstration, took to the jungle rather than return to their homes. And today the red Khmers are in a position to exploit the discontent in the country, areas where the army opened fire on the peasants. The conditions for an active rebellion have been fulfilled one by one. Pamanti continues, information coming in from the provinces early last week seems to confirm that Khmer peasants in Viet Cong areas are now armed and trained. The nucleus of a liberation army is very probably being constituted, and the Phnom Penh government could find itself in a more precarious position before long, particularly if it fails to reassert its authority in the areas abandoned for more than 2 weeks by the central government. He quotes a diplomat who says, "It did not surprise me that in the least to hear announcements of liberated zones being established or of a liberation army being formed. It would not surprise me either if the Viet Cong should say they are pulling out of a certain zones and that from now on dealings should be with the new Khmer authorities. Then they might well announce the return of Prince Sihanouk to one of these zones armed with a powerful radio transmitter." Within days after the coup, elite troops of the Saigon army, with American air and logistic support, entered Cambodian territory for extensive attacks on Viet Cong positions. American advisors accompanied these troops and also took part in planning meetings with military officers of the ARVN and Cambodian armies. Airstrikes and large-scale attacks continued through late March and early April. The Viet Cong response was predictable. Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops simply moved away from the sparsely inhabited border regions and deeper into Cambodia, and for the first time began to take an active part in creating a Cambodian guerrilla army. They also, for the first time, conducted military operations against Cambodian troops. Shortly before the full American ARVN invasion began in late April, the situation was described as follows by T.D. Allman. Under Sihanouk, areas of Viet Cong control were measured in kilometers, even meters, from the border. Now that they are measured in districts or whole provinces, in Takeo, Kampot, and Kandal provinces, south of Phnom Penh, the villages have been taken over by mixed bands of armed Cambodians and Vietnamese calling themselves Sihanouk's army. Le Monde comments editorially that the Red Khmer movement is led by able men, and now that it has some support in the countryside, it can no longer be dismissed, as Washington tends to do, as a mere appendage of the North Vietnamese Communist Party. The new government in exile announced by Sihanouk from Peking will probably include the 3 delegates to the Cambodian parliament mentioned earlier, who were elected with overwhelming majorities in the last 1966 election and can hardly be considered Vietnamese agents. They are generally regarded as the only delegates elected who represent something other than the feudal or wealthy elements in Cambodian society. See Roy Opp citation. And they appear to have a reputation for honesty and integrity that is rare among Cambodian politicians. Among those who have joined Sihanouk in China are Huat Sambat, Cambodian delegate to the United Nations. Pen Nauth, one of his long-term associates and advisors. Field describes him as a close collaborator of Sihanouk and with him an architect of Cambodian neutrality. and Chan Sang, formerly Minister of Education and Minister of National Economy and editor of the leading left-wing journal, one of the outstanding personalities and political figures of Cambodia, until his exile to Paris in 1967 during the early stages of preparation for the takeover of the right. On departing from Paris to join Sihanouk, Chan Sang said that the coup has advanced the revolutionary cause by 5 years. Commenting, Lecoutre writes, "Has anyone ever seen such incompetent sorcerers' apprentices as the plotters of Phnom Penh, who in less than a month will have thrown their country into a civil war and brought it to the edge of an international war, and made the most important and prestigious personality of their country the unconditional ally of the revolutionary movement?" Lecoutre, who sees the hand of the Americans behind the coup, describes it as a suicide operation, quote unquote, for the American Party, which offers their enemies an opportunity to deploy themselves with a popular base over the whole Indochina theater. As already noted, the view that the perpetrators of the coup may have ensued their own doom is shared by Allman. Henry Kam of the New York Times notes further that among foreign observers in Phnom Penh, disenchantment with the new regime has set in with a vengeance. The uncharitable feelings of most observers toward the Lon Nol governments are compounded of evidence of their military futility, revulsion over atrocities, and callousness toward the large Vietnamese minority, scorn for the political naivete that led the leaders to put real faith in the possibility of help from the International Control Commission or the United Nations to drive out the Viet Cong, and impatience with a cacophony of blusterous and chauvinistic talk and empty mock martial gestures that, such as putting high school girls in kakai shirts to cover an air of feckless irresolution. He also notes that the United States government seems to share this contempt, as one must conclude from the manner in which it has carried out the invasion, hardly bothering even to inform the Cambodians. Whatever the reason, America seems clearly to have decided to make war in Cambodia without the Cambodians, and it is a measure of the low morale of Cambodia that she accepted this without immediate outcry, as though, like Vietnamese communist incursion, it is a fact of life beyond her control. A diplomat in Phnom Penh recently stated that we probably shall look back on these days as the opening phases of Cambodian civil war. Citing this observation, T.D. Allman writes, "For the first time since independence in 1953, Cambodians were killing Cambodians. The Phnom Penh's government hold on the rural population was in doubt. The average Cambodian wants most of all to live in peace, but already he is being urged to choose sides. On the government side are the army, most of the business class, the aristocracy, the intellectuals, and government functionaries. Ranged against the new government are some 40,000 Vietnamese troops, NLF and North Vietnamese, who so far have taken only a small role in the anti-government movement, the tiny Khmer Rouge guerrilla movement, and most importantly, a sizable but unknown proportion of Cambodia's 6 million peasants, who still see Sihanouk as a god king and the nation's only leader." Speculating a year ago about the prospects of the Cambodian rebels for success, Michael Leifer wrote that these prospects, quote, will depend discounting external factors, not only on the exploitation of genuine grievance, but also on the ability to identify with the nationalist cause for which Sihanouk has been the most ardent and passionate advocate. This would seem unlikely, close quote. Before March 18th, this was a reasonable assessment. Now, however, Sihanouk, the, quote, most ardent and passionate advocate of the national cause, the person whom one American expert described as being a significant expression of the Cambodian people's will, has identified himself with the rebels. It is doubtful that the right-wing Lon Nol government, with its narrow urban base, can counter this popular force or win it over. The March 18 coup reflects a split within the Cambodian elite, the exact nature of which is not entirely clear. However, two things do seem clear. First, the best known members of the Cambodian left are now aligned with Sihanouk. Second, the Cambodian left is now in a position to mobilize the peasantry, capitalizing on Sihanouk's prestige and the backing of the Vietnamese resistance forces, while the Lon Nol government, isolated from the peasantry, will increasingly be driven into an alliance with the extreme right-wing forces in Indochina, the Saigon authorities, and the Americans. The bankruptcy of the elite that managed the coup is reflected clearly by its resort to terror against the Vietnamese minority, reported in ample detail in the press. The reports of Cambodian military operations fortify this impression of weakness and ineptitude. We know what to expect when we read the description of the commanding officer who sent Cambodian civilians, ethnically Vietnamese, who were described as, quote, volunteers to be mowed down by crossfire in a well-publicized story. The Cambodian commandant, an elegant youngish man, shirtless and wearing a heavy gold necklace, lay like a sultan on an army bed in the clearing among the bamboo trees. He lounged on his bed, coolly talking into the field telephone. Then he asked whether there was news in Phnom Penh of help from the Americans. It is interesting to observe that Viet Cong strategy. In the same incident, according to a detail by Allman, the Viet Cong captured the village of Sang, killed 8 soldiers, and distributed arms and ammunition to the villagers in the name of Sihanouk's army. 3 Cambodian spies reported that the Viet Cong were backed by local Khmer and Cham villagers who had joined the communist forces. More generally, Le Monde reports that the NLF in Cambodia is not trying to capture the capital, but to establish, quote, free zones where the Red Khmers can build up their own armies. The North Vietnamese would rather arm the peasantry than establish a puppet regime. Jean-Claude Pamonti writes after the American invasion that the aim of the war is no longer to push the Viet Cong out of Cambodia, but to prevent their gaining enough local support and power to sooner or later threaten General Lon Nol's government. On one side, an embryonic Khmer Communist Party, backed by active and vital support from the Viet Cong, has temporarily allied with Prince Sihanouk to organize a liberation army. On the other, a large segment of the upper class has called for foreign aid in order to build up its authority throughout the country. Pabino's report has a familiar ring to it. So that's that section. It's, the second section. So you can see, basically it's the same thing. The U.S. government used Lon Nol, General Lon Nol, the military dictatorship to, slit the throats of the Cambodian people. He was a, military right-wing dictator, thrown in power by the CIA, launched a, Vietnamese, anti-Vietnamese ethnic, slaughter campaign against the ethnic Vietnamese of Cambodia, and was backed by the full force of the U.S. government. The propaganda of the U.S. government, standard stuff, all lies, deceit, frauds. They are white frauds, racist, murderers, throat-slitting Nazi American white gangsters. And in addition, we talked about, Allman made a lot of comments about, the fact that the coup of Sihanouk was very short-sighted. He was, the most popular and, very, very, good national leader. He was the revered national leader and almost hero of the Cambodian people. And the U.S. government, removing him, ousting him, was the worst thing that happened to Cambodia. The typical thing, the throat-slitting white American, racist Nazi gangsters. Okay, I'm going to take a short break. It's going to be 1 minute. I'll be back in 1 minute. We have, we just have looks like 130, 136 pages. So we're on 108. So it's about 28 pages. It'll take another hour and a half. So, I'll be back in just 1 minute. Okay, so section 3. The Viet Cong strategy of establishing freed zones in which the Red Khmers can build up their own armies based on the peasantry no doubt explains Stanley Carnot's observation that the communists have carefully refrained from moving against towns they could probably capture without firing a shot. As he also notes, they have not even attempted to prompt uprisings in areas like western Battambang province, where a local left-wing dissident movement has been implanted for years. They appear fully confident that, without the commitment of major forces, they can create a peasant-based guerrilla force loyal to Sihanouk that will restore him to power, this time in a firm alliance with the Cambodian left and at a peasant-based popular movement. Reports from the field support this judgment. No doubt the Americans will agree as well. This is surely one major reason for the invasion of Cambodia during the last week of April. There were no doubt other supporting reasons. Nixon implied in his April 30th speech announcing the invasion that the alternatives were escalation or defeat. That seems not an unreasonable assessment. The invasion may indicate that Vietnamization, quote unquote, is so fragile that even reduction of American forces to 250,000 is regarded as unfeasible in Washington. What is feared that to secure this immense army of occupation, much wider areas of Indochina must be turned into free fire zones, empty and desolate. However, it is hardly clear that there are reasons in any serious sense, for the new escalation, any more than one can hope to construct a sensible and reliable explanation for the thinking, such as it was, that led to the unprovoked bombardment of North Vietnam in 1965. Shortly after the anti-Sihanouk coup in 1959, the Saigon government diplomatic representative in Phnom Penh, later a minister under Diem, who appears to have been implicated in the coup, told a reporter, "You must understand that we in Saigon are desperate men. We are a government of desperados." An accurate description which applies with equal force to those who design American policy. These men have enormous power at their command and can do very much as they wish with few restrictions. As recent events once more reveal, the Constitution and unorganized public opinion serve as no serious constraint, and international law and our solemn treaty obligations, quote unquote, the United Nations Charter, for example, which remains, if anyone cares, the supreme law of the land, have long faded from consciousness. Reference to them has become, quote, moralistic or, quote, naive, as it no doubt is. More seriously, the victims have absolutely no way of striking back at the United States, the source of aggression, and it is unlikely that their allies will risk the fury of American nuclear attack by threatening the United States with retaliation. Therefore, the American government can, quote, experiment with one technique of destruction after another, quote, population control methods, close quote, and other police state tactics, assassination teams to destroy the enemy, quote, infrastructure, defoliation, forced evacuation, concentration of the population in camps and urban slums, bombardment on a scale unknown in human history, invasion of other countries, and whatever other ideas happen to occur to them. The disparity of force between the American government and its victims is so enormous that American planners can pretty much do as they wish without fear of serious retaliation. In such a situation, it is quite pointless to try to explain the actions of these frightened and limited men on rational ground to the Nazi throat-slitting, violent white gangsters of the United States. They have force at their command and can use it with impunity. Further explanations are, in a sense, superfluous. President Nixon wishes us to believe that after a right-wing coup in Cambodia, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese have become a more serious military threat to South Vietnam. This is as convincing as his fantasies about North Vietnam surrounding the South with its awesome military might. He also alluded ominously to the sanctuaries in Svay Rieng province, Parrot's Beak, as close to Saigon and Baltimore as Baltimore is to Washington, and spoke of the rapid NVA buildup in Cambodia in April. As to the later, military sources in Saigon report that they know of no communist buildup in Cambodia. What of the prior situation in the densely populated flat rice land of Svay Rieng province? The province was visited by T.D. Allman a few months ago. Four things he wrote seem evident as a result of his investigation. I wrote, the Viet Cong used Cambodian territory much less than the Americans in Saigon claim. United States aircraft violate Cambodian airspace and bomb and strife Cambodian territory in violation of the United States guidelines, frequently with no cause at all, and much more often than the United States admits. In fairness to all sides, it is obvious that the Americans, South Vietnamese, Viet Cong, and North Vietnamese are all making some degree of effort to keep the war out of Cambodia. The Cambodian effort to hold ground against all comers belies any reports that they have a, quote, agreement with the communists, or for that matter, with the Americans. He describes this dangerous sanctuary as an absolutely flat country, rice paddies, villages, occasionally a small grove of trees, scanning the open horizon, broken only by Cambodian villages and mango groves. There seemed no place the Viet Cong could hide, let alone establish a permanent sanctuary. Allman spent a day in the border district of Chen Tria the evening before American planes had bombed and strafed a village 2,300 meters inside Cambodia and clearly visible across a rice field, killing 2 farmers and destroying a hectare of paddy. The district officer stated, "There are no Viet Cong in Chen Tria district. They never enter our territory more than 500 meters, even at night. Mostly they are passing. There are no camps here, no sanctuaries." During 1969, the district officer added, "In this one district of Svay Rang province, 9 Cambodians were killed by American bombs or guns. 20 Cambodians were wounded, 100 hectares of rice paddy was damaged, and more than 100 farm animals were killed. No Viet Cong were killed by Americans, and no Cambodians were killed by Viet Cong." As they spoke, a policeman entered to report bombing and strafing 200 meters inside Cambodia. "Incidentally, there is no one there," the policeman reported. "No Viet Cong, no Cambodian, but one rice field and a grove of mango trees are being destroyed." From these accounts, it is not difficult to predict the character of the invasion of Svay Rang province, now in its initial stages. It will lead to the destruction of villages and displacement of population, but probably little else. Early reports indicate that this is exactly what is being achieved. James Sturba reports that few people were to be seen in the Parrot's Peak, but animals were everywhere, water buffalo and herds of cattle near abandoned houses. The ARVN soldiers, as usual, were stealing chickens. Dozens of houses were burned by South Vietnamese troops in the Parrot's Peak. Their charred frames dotted the landscape. American troops will be unable to match the ARVN accomplishment since the Fish Hook area they are invading is more thinly settled, but at least they are trying. Troops of the United States 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment burned down at least 5 villages, each with 30 to 40 houses. Officers said they were told to burn villages because they could be of use to North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops. The Americans met no resistance, and villagers fled. Peter Arnett is quoted as reporting that American troops entering Snool were ordered to blow the town away, quote unquote. Returning to our comrades in arms, Gloria Emerson reports from Prasad, totally abandoned before the South Vietnamese troops entered. French-speaking General Do Chow Tri, smoking a pipe and holding a swagger stick, did not discourage his troops from writing anti-Cambodian slogans on the wall of buildings. Now is the time for the killers to pay in blood, a reference to the Cambodian massacre of 89 Vietnamese in Prasad on April 10, when the Lon Nol government was desperately attempting to hold its authority by brutally fanning ethnic hostilities. If this was a triumphant day for the South Vietnamese, it was a bewildering, frightening one for the Cambodians who hid inside their houses near Route 1 or fled their homes. Close to the Vietnamese border at Ga Duaha, only a few men watched the South Vietnamese troops pass. They stared with tight, sullen faces. Just outside Prasad, the doors of the wooden houses that stand out on stills were empty and silent. There were thick locks on the doors of the better houses, and portraits of Prince Sihanouk, the deposed chief of the state of Cambodia, still hung on the walls of one porch. The Observer of London, May 3, 1970, cites reports that seem to carry a grimmer significance. Apart from the Viet Cong casualties, the Americans have announced that scores of persons have been detained by the Allied forces. They have been led out of the area under guard, blindfolded with their hands tied behind their backs, suspected of being North Vietnamese soldiers. The area is inhabited by many civilians, both Vietnamese and Cambodians, families of rubber plantation workers and woodcutters. This lends a fearful emphasis to the remarks of American officers on the spot that the American observation and gunship helicopters have been given clearance, quote, to fire on anything that moves in an area extending about 3 miles north and west of the ground operations. What are the Cambodian troops? Jack Foisey, reporting from Svay Rang, describes the churlishness of the Cambodian army troopers who appeared dismayed that the Saigon government was occupying the town, even though at the moment they were allies. In fact, too subtle, apparently, for the simple peasant mind to comprehend. And so we proceed to save the people of Cambodia from Vietnamese aggression, just as we have been saving the Laotians and the Vietnamese themselves. It is quite difficult to believe that American strategists expect to find the highly mobile Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops sitting and waiting after several days of obvious preparations for an invasion, any more than they expect to find Pathet Lao and North Vietnamese troops strolling through the marketplace when they wipe out a Laotian village from the air. The experience of earlier sweeps in South Vietnam has been that there was little contact with communist forces and virtually no correlation between contact and prior intelligence. This is a story in itself, still largely untold. For example, a map of Operation Junction City in the 1966-1967 yearbook of the 25th Infantry Division shows extensive objective areas that were devastated prior to the sweep, but virtually no quote-unquote contact. Snipers fire or soldiers, dead or alive, within the objective areas, several of which were heavily settled. It is virtual certainty that the great victories will be claimed in the Cambodian invasion and that the military will release reports of arms caches and rice destroyed, military bases demolished, and much killing of North Vietnamese, quote-unquote, i.e. people who find themselves in the way of an American tank or in an area bombed or strafed. So many reputations and careers are at stake that glorious victories of the Cambodian invasion are guaranteed in the American fraud state. Furthermore, some of these reports may even be correct. On probabilistic grounds alone, one would expect that American military intelligence can't always be wrong about everything. The headquarters of the Vietnamese resistance forces and the bases that they use for R&R must be somewhere, and they may well be found and destroyed during the American Saigon sweep. Whether the invading troops will withdraw remains to be seen. That the countryside will be devastated and its population removed or destroyed is reasonably certain. Very probably, if these territories are abandoned by the invading forces, some at least will be joined to the area on South Vietnamese side of the border as an extended free fire zone. Section 4. The amazing unanticipated popular revulsion against the American invasion of Cambodia indicates that it will be very difficult, in the short run at least, for the government to make use of American ground troops to ensure its control of those who remain refractory. The Pentagon will therefore have to learn to rely more effectively on the technology of destruction. Chances are that a ring of fire and devastation will surround the outposts of the free world, quote unquote, in South Vietnam, protecting the American army of 250,000 men and its permanent bases from attack. If Eastern Cambodia must be sacrificed to this end, neither General Thu nor his employers can be expected to shed many tears. As in Laos and Vietnam, the United States is intervening, whatever its immediate reasons, to support reactionary, right-wing, militaristic, even feudalistic elements, and to suppress an emerging peasant-based popular movement of national independence. As I've already noted, there is some evidence that the CIA had a finger and perhaps a hand in the March 18th coup. In any event, when Sihanouk refused to retire to France like a well-behaved Bao Dai, as the Viet Cong strategy of arming the peasants and encouraging the formation of a pro-Sihanouk Cambodian Liberation Army became evident, American intervention became essential. Tad Solk reported from Washington that the Khmer Rouges, quote unquote, the Cambodian equivalent of the South Vietnamese Viet Cong guerrillas, may become an important political element in Cambodia, in the opinions of the United States government experts on Indochina, quote unquote. The liberation forces, if they continue to expand, can be expected to link up with the NLF, now the Provisional Revolutionary Government of South Vietnam, the Pathet Lao, and the North Vietnamese in a general Indochina war against the right-wing elements backed by the United States, racist Nazi American throat-slitting gangsters. It is widely admitted that the revolutionary groups we confront in Laos and Vietnam, and soon very likely in Cambodia, are the only indigenous forces that have any immediate prospect of mobilizing mass support in Indochina. For example, a recently published RAND Corporation study concedes that apart from the Neo-Leo Haksat, the political party of revolutionary movement in Laos, there is no broadly based political organization in Laos, a country run by an extremely small elite, quote unquote. To be more precise, hardly more than a facade of the Americans. Similarly, the Council of Vietnamese Study of CDAG, the Southeast Asian Development Advisory Group, in its meetings of May 3rd, 1969, struggles with the fact that the NLF is the, quote, best organized political group, the strongest political group in South Vietnam. The same conclusions are reached in scholarly literature. For example, the Vietnam scholar Alan Goodman concludes, indeed, it would appear that the organization of a cadre structure and the nurturing of strong local governments will continue to be the forte of the Viet Cong in South Vietnam. Approaches peaceful conditions. The ultimate victor in South Vietnam will not be that party which necessarily wins the war, but the party which organizes for the peace. Thus, the United States is forced to resort to the Phoenix program to destroy the Viet Cong infrastructure and to other means of annihilation and population control with which it experiments throughout Indochina. In Cambodia, too, it is likely that the United States will have to undertake intensive bombardment of civilian targets as in Laos, or direct occupation as in South Vietnam, to maintain the the right-wing elements to which it is committed. So you can see I'm going to just make a few comments on this section. So basically, the U.S. government, they are supporting military right-wing dictatorships. The Nazi throat-slitting American white gangsters supported military dictatorships. They allowed the CIA to overthrow the democratically elected popular leader. It doesn't matter. It's all American, what American whites want. That's all that matters. They are throat-slitting white Nazi American fascist gangsters. And in addition to that, they were conducting basically a slaughter campaign, a genocide campaign, a population control experiment in Indochina. This was a population control experiment using the Indochinese as laboratory experiments of mass murder weapons, the racist throat-slitting Nazi American white gangsters. Nor is this likely to be the end. The Far Eastern Economic Review comments editorially that there are grounds for, quote, claiming that the revolutionary situation in the region is excellent. Extending their gloomy speculations about Indochina, they proceed to envisage a people's war supplied and supported from Laos, engulfing the northeast and north of Thailand, eventually linking up with dissidents in the south, fomented by Ching Peng and the rump of the Malayan Communist Party, and spreading across the country to join hands with the numerous factions in open revolt within Burma. From here, the revolutionary line leads via the Nagas and other minorities to the Naxalites and West Bengal. It is not difficult to imagine other reasons in each of the countries named for the expansion of, quote, people's war. The American involvement alone is the contributing factor. The United States can hardly expect to turn Thailand into a military base for its Southeast Asian wars without calling forth a response by, quote, unquote, communists who refuse to follow the rules. Domestic reasons are also not difficult to conjure up. The editorial comment in the Far Eastern Economic Review also notes that, quote, China would probably be much happier with a neutralist Laos and a neutralist Cambodia. This is no doubt true. Sihanouk, for one, continually emphasized this point, as noted earlier. The United States, however, is unlikely to permit this option. By its insistence on imposing right-wing military dictatorship governments with virtually no popular support on the people of Indochina, the United States may ultimately succeed in bringing about a Pacific or even a global war. Though this may not appear at the moment, it is easy to imagine a sequence of events that would lead to this consequence. In any event, the future for the people of Southeast Asia is dim. The United States is using its incomparable technological resources and its internationally based military forces to occupy and destroy vast territories, to uproot and demoralize the population. to disrupt the social life in the areas it cannot physically control. So long as the American people tolerate these atrocities, the people of Southeast Asia can look forward only to continued misery. One can, of course, trace the policy of expansion into Asia far back in American history. The post-war American effort to dominate Southeast Asia has an element of, quote, rationality, according to the perceived interests of many of those who manage American society. Unfortunately for the people of Indochina and the United States, who will pay the price? It is unlikely that the price will be that described by Professor Fairbank in the remarks quoted at the beginning of chapter 1. A war against the people of Asia and a growing totalitarian menace in the United States of America. Nonetheless, the grim game is far from ended. So long as the war continues, it may be possible to reduce inflation and unemployment to tolerable limits, quote unquote, without imposing the kinds of controls that are unacceptable to the business community. If so, American workers may refuse to continue to sacrifice their jobs and livelihood in the cause of American domination of Southeast Asia. Perhaps much wider circles can be drawn into the movement against the war. There is no doubt that many people are confused and troubled. With serious work, they might be brought to join the great numbers who actively oppose the war. There is resistance in the military and continuing resistance to military conscription. According to a recent report, the Oakland Induction Center, which processes draftees for all of Northern California and a portion of Nevada, says more than half of the young men ordered to report fail to show up, and 11% of those who do show up refuse to serve. Many more people are refusing to support the criminal acts by payment of war taxes. As I write, there is an unprecedented student strike. Acts of sabotage directed against the military are on the increase. An underground is developing as such criminals as Daniel Berrigan refuse to accept the legitimacy of the authority that has sentenced them to prison for trying to impede the war machine. Congress is seething. The state legislature are referring opposition in surprisingly strong ways. In short, those who still hope to subdue and hold their Southeast Asian colonies have plenty of trouble in store for them, here as well as there. To pursue the war, the government will have to subdue dissent and protest, which is sure to take more militant forms as the war expands and its character becomes continually more clear. It may have to make a choice between abandoning this war with long-term and unforeseeable consequences for American imperialist colonial policy and jettisoning what remains a structure of American democracy. The choice might arise fairly soon. Consider, for example, the legislation induced by Senators Hatfield, McGovern, and others to cut off funds for continuation of the war. This was a courageous move on their part. It establishes a sharp criteria by which it can be determined whether any congressman is for the war or for peace in Indochina. Suppose that it becomes law, then the choice will be posed quite clearly. I would hesitate to predict the outcome. Postscript. Just over a month has passed since the preceding article on Cambodia was submitted for publication in the first week of May. In the interim, there have been several interesting developments. Our man in Saigon, Vice President Kai, has officially rejected the, quote, silly agreement of silly people that if someday the Americans leave Cambodia, then the South Vietnamese will have to follow them out of Cambodia too. On the same day that the Marshal spoke so frankly in Saigon, a spokesman for the Lon Nol government, Major Am Rong, declared that, quote, we will never be dominated by the Vietnamese. That is why the population is rising against them. He noted explicitly that he referred to all Vietnamese. There are other confirmatory implications. Henry Kam reports deep uneasiness among the sectors of the population that most enthusiastically supported the government of Lon Nol and Sirik Matak, a result of the occupation of ARVN troops of a major part of Cambodia, east of the Mekong, and the presence of the South Vietnamese troops in Phnom Penh. In the university and high schools, reports of killings, rapes, and plundering by South Vietnamese troops circulate and find an eager hearing. Faculty members reported today that a delegation of student leaders has called on General Sirik Matak to express concern over the takeover of much of Cambodia by South Vietnamese and over the conduct of these troops. In Phnom Penh, posters appeared on the glass walls of the government department store in the capital asking South Vietnamese troops to withdraw from the Cambodian style. The posters charged that the troops from Saigon had ill-treated Cambodian villagers, violated Cambodian women, and destroyed Cambodian property. These charges had been known to correspondents ever since South Vietnamese units moved into Cambodia, but no one quite expected that Phnom Penh government would come out with open accusations so soon. The same correspondent reports that territorial occupation in parts of Cambodia is Saigon's aim in the deal with it has apparently struck with America to make Cambodia safe for democracy. General Dao Cao Tri, the top AVRVN commander in Cambodia, explained the difficulty of determining whether the Cambodians in the villages being occupied are for Sihanouk, Lon Nol, or the Viet Cong. He also complained of the unwillingness of the Cambodian army to fight. He announced that if the Cambodians should continue to mistreat our compatriots, referring to massacres perpetrated by the Cambodian army, then our army will have an appropriate reaction, details unspecified. Marshal Key also explained, we will continue to maintain our military presence in Cambodia, not only to destroy the communists, but also to provide protection for the lives and property of 600,000 resident Vietnamese in Cambodia. The Vietnamese minister in charge of the problem of ethnic Vietnamese in Cambodia suggested that they may be resettled in the Cambodian border provinces of Svay Rieng, Ta Keo, and Kampot, where they would live in the security of the South Vietnamese units operating there and could earn their living in large part by working for and trading with those units. Obviously, then, it is anticipated that ARVN troops will remain in these regions in substantial force. Speaking in the Cambodian town of Neak Long, Marshal Kai announced that 11 airfields are being constructed in Cambodia by the South Vietnamese army to facilitate air operations. President Thu also chimed in, predicting that his forces would be engaged in a long war in Cambodia. We must help Cambodia as we must help ourselves, he added, and make sure that neither Sihanouk or another communist chief returns to power. Terrence Smith reports from Saigon that President Thu expects ARVN troops to operate in Cambodia for an indefinite period after United States units are withdrawn, with continued American logistic and combat support to sustain those operations. President Thu seems to share some of the uneasiness of the Cambodians over the behavior of Marshal Kai and General Tri in Cambodia. Henry Kam reports from Saigon that Marshal Kai, quote, was reported to be seeking powers that would make him something akin to a viceroy of eastern Cambodia, and there is concern as well over the imperious conduct of General Tri, which may suggest possible political ambitions. Saigon's intention to maintain its troops indefinitely on Cambodian territory is reported from Washington to be apparently enjoying full United States blessing. Silk also notes that the administration admits, quote, the possibility that the United States would provide tactical air support to the South Vietnamese troops in Cambodia after the Americans had left. More interestingly, he observes that now administration officials speak freely, quote, of the charging mission of the Saigon troops from the initial attack on the sanctuaries in the support of the Lon Nol government. He explains the basic reason for another report from Washington. The Lon Nol regime will need assistance to deal with guerrilla and subversive activities. Officials said that in some way the situation developing in Cambodia was beginning to resemble South Vietnam in 1960 when the Viet Cong began the rebellion against the Saigon regime. It is reassuring that senior American officials are now beginning to comprehend, or at least admit, what has been fairly obvious to readers of the world press since the end of March. In fact, it is likely that one of the original motives for the American ARVN invasion was to support the Lon Nol government against the mounting threat of guerrilla and subversive activities. Congressman Hamilton Fish summarized a private briefing by Undersecretary of State Richardson for selected members of Congress in a letter to constituents. The congressmen were told, Following the fall of Sihanouk, the new anti-communist government cut all supply lines of the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong except the Ho Chi Minh Trail. To re-secure their severed supply routes, Viet Cong and NVA began moving out of the enclaves, thereby threatening the overthrow of the Cambodian government. It is against this background that the American South Vietnamese strikes into Cambodia were ordered. A fuller briefing would have explained that the American ARVN military strikes across the border, beginning directly after the Lon Nol coup, were also a factor in impelling the communist troops to move out of the enclaves and threaten the overthrow of the coup regime. Nixon's original claim was that the American ARVN invasion was motivated by increased North Vietnamese military activity, which threatened the American military position in Vietnam. As noted earlier, this is plainly absurd. An anti-communist coup in Phnom Penh could hardly increase the North Vietnamese threat to American troops in South Vietnam. And as noted above, American military sources in Saigon denied knowledge of any such increased threat. Further information has since appeared. A staff report of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee states that the United States military authorities in Saigon and Washington do not support Nixon's claim. The commonly expressed intelligence estimate was that the communist forces had moved into a defensive position and were dispersing westward in Cambodia away from the South Vietnamese borders. The staff was informed that the American invasion was directed against the enemy sanctuaries, against the main COSVN, Central Office South Vietnam, control headquarters for South Vietnam. Though 9 days after the invasion, COSVN had disappeared from military briefings. Ted Sulk reports from Washington that, quote, the United States is known to favor a long-range pacification program in Cambodia under South Vietnamese and Thai supervision. As in Vietnam, B-52 raids will continue on enemy supply lines, a phrase which will no doubt signify in Cambodia what it has come to mean in Vietnam. The reason for this long-range pacification program is that Prince Sihanouk still enjoys widespread popularity in the Cambodian countryside, and that this popularity provides fertile ground for the insurgency, which is proceeding apace as revolutionary cells are being established in villages. A further problem is the Cambodian economy. As Sok directly puts it, the economy was badly hurt by the destruction of rubber plantations during Allied thrusts into Cambodia, by Allied thrusts to be more exact. Cambodia's largest rubber plantation, the Chuk plantation, was attacked by 10,000 ARVN troops and armored vehicles on May 23rd. On the first day of the assault, according to an Associated Press report, quote, a dozen men identified as members of the Khmer Rouge, a Cambodian communist guerrilla force, were reported killed on the plantation's southern edge, and 15 were reported captured. 25 more of the enemy nationality, unidentified, were reported slain. Henry Kam adds from Phnom Penh that according to witnesses, South Vietnamese Air Force planes bombed and strafed the rubber processing plant, leaving it aflame and causing at least 15 deaths among the 550 workers and 80 wounded. The witness reports that no Viet Cong or North Vietnamese forces had been in the plant at the time of the attack, nor had ever been there. Less than an hour later, a second raid dropped napalm on the plant area, wounding a number of persons who were trying to aid those hurt in the first attack. Shortly after, planes were reported to have attacked the villages scattered around the southern half of the vast plantation, as well as the central market and the principal school. Another headline in the same issue of the Times reads, Cambodian drive called a success by U.S. commanders. It reports, for example, the shelling of North Vietnamese troops who were dug in around a small bamboo hut village, and shelling and aerial attacks bombed into ruins every structure, including the Buddhist pagoda. The fate of the 35 Cambodian inhabitants was not known. The same report notes that B-52 strikes have been called in, even in areas known to contain Cambodian villages. South Vietnamese troops reported finding 33 dead civilians, apparently killed by United States bombs in these attacks. The 43,000 South Vietnamese troops have fought well in the judgment of the United States commanders. American pilots have also performed with authority, as the report makes clear. An American biologist, Arthur Westing, visited the Chup rubber plantation last December with the study group investigating American defoliation in Cambodia. See Note 8. On reading the reports describing in harrowing detail the rape of the rubber plantations in Kamang Chang province and the pillage by RVN forces equipped with U.S. arms, supplied with U.S. ammunition, and protected by U.S. Nazi throat-slitting white gangster air cover of the rubber processing factories, he wrote a letter to the New York Times dated May 25th, not accepted for publication, in which he observed, "Rubber has been Cambodia's most important source of international solvency. In December 1st, I examined in some detail the plantations now being laid to waste. The endless acres of carefully tended plantings represented the most productive rubber to be found anywhere in the world. They were a horticultural joy to behold. The processing plant at Chop, just plundered and destroyed with the loss of numerous innocent Cambodian lives, was a showplace of automation and gleaming stainless steel, the pride of that poor country." And so the American forces and their allies, with their newfound aggressiveness, march on to even more glorious victories. A correspondent for the Far Eastern Economic Review suggests that one purpose of the American ARVN invasion was to boost the morale of South Vietnam's army. These troops, he goes on to point out, have been provided with what amounts to a paper victory because they have never actually encountered the communists in any strength in Cambodia. Destroying Cambodian villages is much easier than fighting the Viet Cong at home, Joseph Kraft comments. As General Do Chow Tri, the South Vietnamese Patton, put it, there are no booby traps here and no political infrastructures. For the time being, at least, and there are other rewards as well. Henry Cam reports, witnesses in Chup said that the troops of the South Vietnamese task force had driven off all usable vehicles, loading some with air conditioners, refrigerators, and other appliances taken from the houses of the French managers. AFP reports that the Cambodian mercenary troops are also performing nobly. Thus, 2 battalions of a contingent that formerly served with the United States Special Forces in South Vietnam entered the town of Tan Labet, meeting little resistance from the North Vietnamese, who appeared to have left a few hours earlier. The town, quote, had been pounded by Cambodian artillery and mortars for a week. The main street is piled 5 feet high with rubble. Walls and roofs have collapsed. Not a pane of glass was left unbroken. No building in the center of town escaped the shelling. There are gaping holes everywhere and thousands of spent cartridge cases and jagged pieces of shrapnel lies in the still smoking rubble. Several days before, Gloria Emerson visited the ruined town, quote unquote, of Snool in the Fushok area, destroyed by American fire tanks and artillery. No one reported having seen the northern Vietnamese, in the town or on the rubber plantation, also called Snool, which is about 6 to 10 miles in size. She speculates that the reason for the denials is that the people are afraid, though it is hard to see what they have to gain by denying the presence of North Vietnamese troops after the town has been destroyed by the Americans. Are they mad? One of the rubber workers asked, referring to the attack. Why destroy the whole town when there was no resistance and no shots from the ground? Just to kill Chinese merchants, question mark? The witness, who had left before the fighting started, did not believe, as civilian American witnesses have reported, that the North Vietnamese opened fire on American tank forces. The report continues, quote, no one seems to know how many deaths were caused by the fighting and by the United States airstrike. There are freshly dug graves, but children were buried together. The reporter adds, quote, United States military commanders in Cambodia believe that too much attention has been paid to the damage to Snool. Let us drop the subject, therefore, and turn to other places. Peter Arnett reports that the American troops are facing a, quote, political problem. American foot soldiers are forced to operate in the midst of the civilian population in Cambodia. Quote, the Americans who in Vietnam have difficulties in separating friend and enemy among the civilian population must now try to distinguish good from bad Cambodians. And so the Vietnamese story is being renewed. The tactic of scorched earth leads the Americans to set fire to houses because they may be used by the communists. Cattle are killed for the same reason. Spirals of smoke rose on Sunday above the area, Groups of houses were transformed to heaps of reddening embers. Arnott quotes an American commander who says, "My orders are to burn everything," and reports that air raids have partially destroyed the town of Memot. Villages have been burned and thousands of civilians have fled. An observer comments, "Such actions may drive the Vietnamese population, the rubber plantations, into the ranks of the Viet Cong and the Cambodian population into the arms of the Khmer Rouges if we are not careful." An American briefing officer explained the rules of engagement, quote unquote, to a group of helicopter pilots. "There are Bukoke villages down there. Don't shoot at the villages unless you take fire from them. A dink in the open is fair game, but we don't want to kill innocent civilians. Any questions? Question mark. Only one. How do you distinguish a dink in the open from an innocent civilian? Question mark. And what difference does it make anyway when the other air and ground units are leaving a trail of devastated villages as they march from success to success? Question mark. So far, the only failure has been the inability to discover any of the main targets. The original goal of the American invasion, as President Nixon grandly announced at the outset, was to destroy the legendary COSVN, the Communist Pentagon, to which he pointed on the map as he spoke. References to COSVN have now disappeared from briefings. Quote, "Despite periodic reports to the contrary, knowledgeable military sources say that no part of COSVN has been captured." A writer for the Far East Economic Review defines COSVN as a hypothetical structure in the minds of frustrated American military planners in Saigon. An NLF officer captured in Cholon, South Vietnam, in late May, who believes that the loss of arms and material may set the communist forces back by 3 months. American and South Vietnamese military sources believe it may be as long as 6 months, expressed amazement that the Americans expected to capture the Viet Cong headquarters, pointing out, quote, that after a full month of operations, the Americans and South Vietnamese had not been able to locate a single one of the many prisoners of war camps along both sides of the border. Jean-Claude Pamonti observed that the series of attacks in Cambodia by ARVN and ethnic Cambodian Special Forces units from March 20th gave the Viet Cong plenty of warning, ample time to fall back deeper into Cambodia. Other reports indicate that the Viet Cong were forewarned by the agents of the ARVN General Staff. Pamonti does not believe that the ARVN will be able to keep its forces outside of the Parrot's Beak and Fishhook areas because of growing Viet Cong strength. Even in the Parrot's Beak, it is hard to say who's the hunter, General Tree remarked. Moving back into evacuated areas of Cambodia may not be too easy. Next time around, there will be man-traps and mines. It's bad for the troops' morale, a South Vietnamese officer explained as he had departed from Chup. General Tree complained. The Cambodians refuse to take over. As soon as we pull out of an area, the Viet Cong will move right back in after us. The Cambodian administration and the army have fallen apart. Outside Phnom Penh, they are virtually non-existent. Furthermore, he added, the ethnic Cambodians from Vietnam, trained by the Americans and brought into Cambodia to serve as the nucleus of a new Cambodian army, are gradually turning into bandits. Morale has collapsed, and it appears that they will filter back to South Vietnam. Pamonti observes that one goal of the American intervention was to strengthen the Lon Nol government, which was starting to flounder, and by the end of April controlled only the capital and a few other towns. But the goal has not been achieved. The only relatively secure areas are those occupied by the South Vietnamese army. In fact, he comments, one of the ironies of the Cambodian operation is that the documents captured by American troops reveal that Prince Sihanouk's United Liberation Front is more solidly organized than was originally suspected. The goal is to build a solid organization rooted among the peasants and based on close cooperation between the Cambodians and the Vietnamese communists. The Red Khmers have been assigned a leading role in the movement, which is already at work in strategically important provinces such as Battambang. Bang. If the ARVN attempts to reinvade Cambodia, the South Vietnamese Pathan will find both booby traps and a political infrastructure not merely lightly defended villages to be razed. American reports affirm that North Vietnamese troops are reportedly conducting, quote, an intensive recruiting and proselytizing campaign among the rural population of Cambodia in what official sources here see as an attempt to create a broadly based communist guerrilla organization similar to the Viet Cong in South Vietnam. This is, quote, major shift from the North Vietnamese policy during the last 5 years of remaining relatively isolated in their border sanctuaries and away from rural Cambodias. Prospects for the new policy are good, the report continues. Traditional rural support for the former Cambodian chief of state is still being believed to be strong, and some sources and independent observers believe that a local guerrilla and political apparatus can be formed far more quickly in Cambodia than it took in South Vietnam. Large parts of Cambodia are under communist control, which has greatly expanded since the American ARVN invasion. Prisoners and defectors report that North Vietnamese units have been broken into teams to recruit Cambodian villagers, quote, forming communist governing groups and training guerrillas. The native Red Khmers form the nucleus of the organization. The sources on which this report is based release this analysis with the apparent intention, quote, to justify the Allied thrust into Cambodia. The idea is to show that the invasion followed the North Vietnamese, quote unquote, steps to recruit a pro-Sihanouk army and to organize a popular-based guerrilla movement. The, quote, sources, however, failed to note that American ARVN incursions followed immediately upon the Lon Nol coup of March 18th and thus made it impossible for the Viet Cong and NVA forces to remain in the isolated border regions that they had been using for refuge ever since the ground sweeps and aerial attacks of 1966 to 1967 made the areas of Vietnam where they had been based entirely unlivable. These military actions initiated by the United States also eliminated any possibility that the Lon Nol government might reach an accommodation that would have permitted it to continue Sihanouk's neutralist policies as some specialists believed it intended. Other reports from Washington confirm this assessment. Tad Sok cites intelligence estimates in Washington, which depict the Chinese-backed Sihanouk government in exile as coordinating its operations with the North Vietnamese command in Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge guerrillas are part of what officials in Washington see as a growing body of support for the Sihanouk regime in outlying areas of Cambodia. Fragmentary information reaching here suggests that Sihanouk supporters are busily building a political structure in northeast Cambodia and taking over villages. Experts here have noted that Prince Sihanouk has appealed for support to traditional groups in Cambodia, including our beloved Buddhist monks. In the words of an American specialist, the scenario is being written for a civil war, quote unquote. French sources in general, far better informed, tend to agree. An analysis Le Monde Diplomatique writes, henceforth the situation is clear. On one side, the, quote, reactionaries, the government of General Lon Nol. On the other, the revolutionaries, quote unquote, the Cambodian government and National Union Front of Kampuchea of Peking. The former hold the cities and the latter hold the countryside. The former survive only thanks to the military aid of the imperialists. The latter enjoy all popular support. This is a simple scheme, clear-cut, irrefutable. One knows who are the friends and who are the enemies. Communist efforts to build a popular guerrilla force rely on more than Sihanouk's unquestioned popularity among the peasantry. In some areas, Red Khmer forces already existed in some strength, even during Sihanouk's rule. In 1967, a peasant rebellion in Battambang was suppressed by Lon Nol's army. The peasant forces took to the jungle, allegedly under the scholarship of the popular left-wing delegates from that region. Some scholars trace the rebellion to an attempt by Lon Nol's army to expel peasants from their land in favor of military leaders and their civilian collaborators. It is interesting that documents of the insurgents from that time speak of the, quote, men of the party of treason with Lon Nol at their head, who have compromised with American imperialism and its valets. The Thai and South Vietnamese governments and the American-trained and American-led Khmer Rouge, a perceptive prediction in December 1967. Insurgency had continued in that area since, as American sources also report. Melvin Gurtaw, a Rand Corporation scholar, notes that the Khmer Viet Minh Red Khmers have been active in central and western Cambodia, no less than the provinces bordering Vietnam. Similarly, in the northeastern mountains of Ratanakiri province, insurgency has been reported and shrunk for the past several years. As Jacques de Cornuy notes, communist forces were so strong that an American effort to penetrate the area during the recent invasion after intensive B-52 raids in waves of up to 40 aircraft, dropping 1,000 tons of bombs, was quickly turned back with admitted losses almost equal to the estimated enemy losses. It is expected that these guerrilla units can be rapidly expanded now that Sihanouk, with his popular prestige, has lent his support, and as the Lon Nol government is forced by events toward authoritarianism and repression. The political program of the guerrillas is based on democratization, quote unquote, reforms in favor of the peasantry concerning such matters as the right of private plots and an equitable solution of unjust debt, educational reforms with an emphasis on Khmer language and culture, and so on, along the lines that have proved successful in Vietnam and Laos. Military tactics also seem to be based on a sophisticated effort to achieve political goals, in part by the, quote, judo techniques of the other Indo-Chinese revolutions. T.D. Allman gives a striking example. He points out that when the guerrillas took Ang to Som in the south, as at every other Viet Cong halt in Cambodia, the communist troops seemed more interested in giving political lectures than taking anything from the inhabitants. They left rice untouched, and one villager reported even refused a chicken that was offered to them. Thus, the contrast was between small and well-disciplined bands of Vietnamese soldiers humiliating the Phnom Penh government at virtually no cost in civilian lives and property, and much larger Cambodian forces milling out the countryside, killing Vietnamese civilians deliberately, and many Cambodians by indiscriminate firepower, while their packs bulged with stolen food. The lack of Cambodian military skill, even simple courage or respect for civilian lives and property, seemed more to undercut than support Cambodian claims that the real reason for the uninspiring performance on the battlefield was a lack of foreign military aid. Communist tactics were particularly likely to be effective in towns such as Ang Tassam, where 84 peasants were killed on March 29th by government forces in suppressing the spontaneous pro-Sihanouk demonstration. The Cambodian military forces have repeatedly behaved in such a way as to antagonize the peasantry exactly as occurred in South Vietnam. Lightly defended towns have been blasted by artillery barrages and attacks, and soldiers have often been seen looting after recapture of the towns. Furthermore, popular demonstrations have been harshly repressed, not merely the pre-Sihanouk outbreaks that followed the coup, when 200 Cambodians were killed by Cambodian army units, according to T.D. Allman. Thus, after government MiGs bombed several villages in Sui Rang province in an effort to stop the Viet Cong, a group of outraged people marched toward the provincial capital of Sui Rang. The Viet Cong attacks were not stopped, but the calling of demonstrators was. Cambodian army units fired on it with 75 millimeter recoilless rifles. The crowd of civilians fled, carrying their dead into nearby rice fields, which until last week were peaceful and which now are fields of battle. The vicious pogroms launched by the Lon Nol government, by the United States Nazi throat-slitting American white gangsters against Vietnamese in an apparent effort to stir up chauvinist sentiments among the peasants failed in that purpose. In general, the people took no part in the misdeeds committed by the army and the police. The orders came from above. Most observers think that the communist chances of success in their effort to create a popular resistance movement are high. The Lon Nol government has largely lost control of the country and is buttressed only by a foreign force. Allman comments, certainly as the military defeats continue and as the economy declines and as more of Cambodia is ravaged by war, the communists, who thanks to Sihanouk's still significant popularity in the country, have been able to win support among the population, will gain more adherents and government popularity will decline correspondingly. This will wait until the fruit is ripe and then let it fall by itself, said one disillusioned Cambodian last week. T.J.S. George, who replaced Allman as Far Eastern Economic Review correspondent in Cambodia, essentially agrees. The communist forces may be trusted to go on quietly building up their strength in the countryside. It is Vietnam all over again, heavy military support from outside, keeping the capital relatively safe for the government, and the Viet Cong biding their time around it. Jean-Francois Kahn reports that thousands of peasants have joined the armed resistance during May. The American intervention, he comments, has temporarily harmed the revolutionary forces, but has not really weakened them. On the contrary, it has accelerated the engagement in the battle of a new force, which was neglected by the Saigon General Staff, the indigenous Khmer guerrillas. It is ironic that the American intervention, which was presumably undertaken, in part at least, in an effort to prop up the Long Nol regime, may have administered the coup de grace to Long Nol government. TJS George quotes a perceptive diplomat who believes that, quote, before the American intervention, the present Cambodian government had a sporting chance to consolidate its position, but that the surrender of neutrality and the war losses have changed the perspective. Jacques de Cournoy reports that even in the urban centers, the Long Nol regime has not succeeded, quote, in organizing truly popular meetings in its favor. Jean-Claude Pamanti, who seems better acquainted with Cambodian society and any other current commentator, report that even among the segments of the Khmer elite that were initially quite favorable to the Long Nol regime, support seems to be fading. Among the political clans who are opposed to Prince Sihanouk, only those belonging to the extreme right wing have, for the moment, been willing to rally to the new government. The others are hesitating, or like the Red Khmers, are already fighting it openly. Many began gradually to make up their minds and finally came out for the united front of Sihanouk. Only a few days before the American ARVN invasion, Tom That Thien wrote in the Far Eastern Economic Review that Cambodia's plight will be worse if the South Vietnamese government decides to come to the rescue of Lon Nol and Sarik Matak. Only Saigon's realization that it would embarrass rather than help Lon Nol has so far kept its soldiers from crossing into Cambodia. A reasonable observation, although the deterioration of the position of the Lon Nol government after the American ARVN attacks on Viet Cong's quote-unquote sanctuaries in late March and April, and the Viet Cong NVA reaction, taking over the countryside and initiating a popular armed revolt, might in any event have made this impossible. As the situation continued to deteriorate, the United States was forced to call on its Thai allies. For 20 years since the Thai post-war experiment in parliamentary democracy was brought to an end by a military coup immediately backed by the United States Nazi throat-slitting American white gangsters, the Thai dictatorship has provided the main support for American military efforts in Indochina. At first, the United States hoped to be able to uphold the coup regime in Cambodia with the Khmer Sarai and Khmer Krom, ethnic Cambodians trained by the special forces in Vietnam and directed by the CIA, and through the use of ARVN troops in eastern Cambodia. By the beginning of June, Thai quote-unquote volunteers were also reported on their way. Thai planes also are sent to Cambodia, it is reported. A report from Bangkok adds an interesting twist to the request for assistance from the Thai, traditionally an enemy of Cambodia. According to well-informed sources, Cambodia's premier, Lieutenant General Lon Nol, has asked the Thais for regular troops to defend Phnom Penh because he suspects the Cambodian commanders now guarding the capital may be sympathetic to Prince Nordstrom Sihanouk. Prince Sihanouk once wrote, apropos of the tenuous neutrality of Cambodia in the midst of hostile neighbors, China is in fact synonymous with the survival of Cambodia in independence, peace, and with its territorial integrity. If we keep distant from China, we will be devoured by the vultures who eternally prey upon Khmer territory. This was a constant theme of the prince. Years later, he remarked, Westerners are always astonished that we Cambodians are not disturbed by our future in which China will play such a powerful role. But one should try to put himself in our place. In this jungle, which is the real world, we simple deer, interest ourselves in a dinosaur like China when we are more directly menaced and have been for centuries by the wolf and the tiger, who are Vietnam and Thailand. The wolf and the tiger, the vultures who seek to devour Khmer territory, have now been given carte blanche, in fact, dispatched directly by the United States. And some of its other clients may also be called upon to help. Henry Cam reports, sources whose thinking reflects that the President Nguyen Van Thu expressed a hope that current exchanges of visits between officials of Cambodia and those of nationalist China and South Korea will result in the speedy dispatch to Cambodia of troops from those countries. They advocate this even in the awareness that such action might provoke counter-reaction from communist China and North Korea. Of course, Chinese nationalist troops have long been used by the United States in Laos and formerly, perhaps still today, in Thailand and Burma, while the South Koreans have been compiling a brilliant record for themselves in South Vietnam. It is unfortunately no exaggeration to say that the United States is creating a clique of Nazi, throat-slitting white American gangster states on the fringes of Asia, hoping to enlist them in its anti-communist jihad. Present prospects are for a balkanization of Cambodia, with a central area held by the Lon Nol government or its successor, a region held by the ARVN forces that will consider, quote unquote, Phnom Penh and its military protectorate, a region controlled by Thailand, a northeast region linked to communist-held areas of Laos and Vietnam, and the unpredictable countryside where the Red Khmer guerrillas, backed by the Viet Cong, will be busy organizing the peasants. With justice, a resident in the gloomy majority, quote unquote, of Phnom Penh told a reporter, I'm not hopeful about the future of Cambodia as an independent state. I can't see South Vietnam removing their military presence until the end of the war. Now, when is the end of the war going to be? Question mark. The South Vietnamese now reportedly intend to maintain a bridgehead at Neak Luang on the Mekong with 3 battalions of Marines stationed permanently and an airfield nearby, and also a permanent intervention corridor on the Cambodian side of the frontier that may penetrate almost 20 miles into the interior. And the intentions of the Saigon authorities are only part of the story, as has been already noted. I have discussed so far only the immediate situation in Cambodia, but of course the effects of the American invasion are far broader. The North Vietnamese and the Pathet Lao immediately responded by extending their control of southern Laos, capturing several towns that have long been left under the control of the Royal Lao government and moving onto a Bolovan plateau. This may prompt a further American response, perhaps a further escalation of the war in southern Laos, even an attempt to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail west of Quang Tri. The pro-government Senator Nguyen Gai Hen, one of the leaders of the Catholic refugees from the north, said in Saigon, one can now perceive the early signs of an American South Vietnamese offensive in the region of southern Laos and the installation of a rightist government in Vientiane. A military plan is now being put into action. In the very near future, American South Vietnamese forces will attack the region of southern Laos and the menaced sector of the Thai frontier. The military plan was conceived as encompassing all of Indochina and requiring all the countries concerned to find a final and global solution. The, quote, final and global solution will, of course, involve also Thailand, where one may expect guerrilla warfare to intensify. Sooner or later, it may involve China as well. Chan Sang, a minister in the Sihanouk government, stated in an interview in Paris, the direct intervention of our Chinese friends as volunteers in Cambodia is not excluded if the United States and its valets cross a certain threshold in their aggression by putting our resistance movement in grave difficulties. China cannot accept its defeat. This is surely more than bravado. China has identified itself closely, though so far only in an undertone, with the newly combined Vietnam Khmer Lao resistance forces. And having made this commitment, it is unlikely to watch silently if American escalation puts their future in danger. American observers also finally seem to comprehend this simple fact. United States specialists now realize that what faced the United States now in Southeast Asia is protracted war with virtually no possibility of arriving at a settlement in Vietnam, unless there is a settlement covering Laos and Cambodia at the same time, and perhaps Thailand as well. Prior to the United States entry into Cambodia, it was possible to envisage a settlement embracing only North Vietnam and South Vietnam, with Cambodia and Laos left to one side, presumably continuing their theoretically neutral status. Now there is no question of such an approach. Many government officials now admit that the outlines of a far-ranging civil war are swiftly emerging in Cambodia, and that the situation there is fluid, quote unquote, and dangerous, quote unquote. Many officials expect the civil war to, quote, erupt in a major way at the end of the rainy season in the autumn of 1970, and it will be a great surprise if it does not involve all the countries of Indochina and perhaps Thailand as well. How the Soviet Union will react to this quite serious blow to its prestige and influence as the Indochinese revolutionary movement, now unified, seems for the moment to be settling into the lap of China remains to be seen. Russia, of course, has the capacity to respond in so many parts of the world. It is interesting that even America's Asian allies are showing some reluctance to participate in the latest and to date most perverse of the American adventures in Indochina. At the Jakarta conference in mid-May, attended only by pro-Western governments, including some, like Japan, that are directly involved in the American war in Indochina, the participants refused to allow the foreign minister of the Lon Nol government to attend as a regular delegate or to put forth formal requests for aid. Seville Davis summarizes this, quote, remarkable event, noting that the participants rejected the plea for aid to Cambodia and, quote, the American concept of a defensive alliance, and refused even to send an inspection team to Cambodia. Declining to accept the American government position on Asian security, these powers, quote, distributed their blame impartially among the big powers and tried to lay the basis for a much broader, less military grouping. Considering the composition of the conference, this was indeed a remarkable event, quote unquote, a further testimony to the triumph of American diplomacy and arms in Cambodia. The Cambodia events are arousing some recriminations within the higher circles of a government. According to Tad Solk, high officials are complaining with some bitterness that the White House disregarded intelligence estimates and analysis by the State Department and the CIA and completely misjudged the communist political and military response. Unless one assumes a White House plot to strengthen China at the expense of the Soviet Union, one must also assume that the White House revealed an abysmal misunderstanding of international affairs in its latest maneuvers. President Nixon in Cambodia has succeeded in demonstrating to the world that the United States is exactly what he claimed it to. It is not. A helpless, though hardly pitiful giant, flailing about wildly in an effort to extricate itself from the morass it has created, thundering new threats, who knows whether they are empty, question mark. If the United States does not gradually escalate at war with China, perhaps through an undisciplined, provocative act of the military, or perhaps a desperate move by the civilian authorities, then the architects of this new disaster in Cambodia will not pay the cost of their blundering aggressiveness. Perhaps someday they will acknowledge their honest errors, quote unquote, in their memoirs, speaking of the burdens of world leadership and the tragic irony of history. Their victims, the peasants of Indochina, will write no memoirs and will be forgotten. They will join the countless millions of earlier victims and of tyrants and oppressors, of the throat-slitting Nazi American gangster whites. So that's it. That's the end of the chapter. At War with Asia, Noam Chomsky. It was about 35 pages. Excellent chapter. I recommend you download the book. At War with Asia, Noam Chomsky. The book will be on the description section of the video, and I recommend you download the book. And then the other book is the Against the Crime of Silence. It's the Proceedings of the International War Crimes Tribunal. That will also be available. So I'm going to just make some comments for the end of this chapter. So Cambodia, we discussed Cambodia. Basically, Prince Sihanouk, the United States, as it has done all over the world, has backed military right-wing dictatorships. Through the butt of a pistol, Washington exerts its effects on the local population. It slaughters the population by machine gunning them and then says, now we're in charge. That's how the U.S. government behaves. It is a Nazi group of throat-slitting white gangsters. So that's one aspect. Sihanouk's statement, Sihanouk's hope for Cambodia as an independent state, his wanting to non-align and wanting to be midline, middle of the road, is something that the United States could not accept, and they overthrew him using the CIA and a right-wing military dictatorship. In addition, we talked about the U.S. bombing campaign, and the mass murder of the Cambodian people, the standard stuff. The U.S. government uses racist torture, racist mass murder, racist theft, racist, rape and, pillaging, and then enslavement of the people. That is the standard theme. The U.S. government enslaved the Cambodian people in an economic slavery system in which the capitalists of the United States siphoned the oil out, siphoned the rice paddies, all the, rubber plantations. You saw the rubber plantations. They were all siphoned out, or they were bombed. The U.S. bombed some of the rubber plantations. We saw the rubber plantation being bombed by U.S. forces. But the enslavement is the key. The enslavement of the, Cambodian people is the key to keep this Cambodians in the state of racist subjugation and slavery. And that is the U.S. government. That's why it does its military dictatorships, because it, has happiness. It gains happiness and garners happiness by enslaving the third world peoples all over the world. This is the standard theme across the world. We also learned, something about China, about Sihanouk's concern with China. He was very interested in allying with China. The United States would not allow it. The United States was, crushing the Chinese in every way, shape, or form. It was a menace. The Chinese were a menace, as stated by, Nixon and his people. He was an anti-Chinese, racist American Nazi, throat-slitting gangster. That was Richard Nixon, an anti-Chinese, throat-slitting American gangster white. And that was one of the things, basically whether Russia or China respond. The bottom line was that if the United States placed the Khmer and the Khmer people or the Cambodians into grave danger, it would result in, China getting embroiled in the conflict and coming to the aid of Sihanouk and, the Cambodian people. China did not openly support the war. They were not openly supportive of the war. They were definitely following the war in the periphery, in the sidelines, to ensure that the United States did not create a bad situation. And we also reviewed the Jakarta conference, where all the Asian allies, did not agree with Lal Nol governments. They did not agree. They scorned the Lal Nol government, which was the United States military dictatorship in Cambodia. The typical response, even the military dictators of Southeast Asian alliances in Jakarta did not, justify the Lal Nol government, because they were committing massive atrocity, murder campaigns against the people. They were, slaughtering the ethnic Vietnamese in a genocide, a U.S.-backed genocide of the ethnic Vietnamese. The standard thing, the U.S. government throat-slitting American white Nazi thugs and gangsters. And finally, the last thing that we did was the pogroms. The vicious pogroms were launched by the Lal Nol government. We talked about those, the mass murder campaign, and we talked about the bombing raids on many of the, the plantations. The U.S. government used mercenaries from ethnic Cambodians in Vietnam to, enact its actions in Cambodia. So that was it. I'm glad you could join us. I'm going to finish with some notes. Again, grab the book from the description section of my video. Again, I recommend you read it. Like I said, I do make changes in the book, small changes for the sake of clarity. So if you read it, it'll be very helpful for you, because I think reading the book and listening to it in his own words is always the best approach. So we talked today about Chapter 3, Cambodia, in Noam Chomsky's book, At War with Asia. In this chapter, we discussed the deceitful butchers of Nazi-American white supremacy and their murder campaign in Vietnam with respect to their white fraud press that peddles lies, fabrications, falsifications, and omissions for the sake of their colonial conquest in Cambodia. This is coupled by their enslavement of the Cambodian people in a vicious system of mass murder and ethnic cleansing of the Vietnamese in this land. The racist American murderous Nazi throat-slitting whites conducted a genocide of the Vietnamese people in Cambodia. Using their military right-wing dictatorship of General Lon Nol, the U.S. government Nazi gangsters targeted the ethnic Vietnamese for genocide. They murdered thousands of ethnic Vietnamese and created hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese refugees. We also discussed the right-wing dictatorship and the South Vietnam ouster of President Sihanouk, who was the democratic popular leader of Cambodia and was revered by his people. Sihanouk was trying very hard to maintain non-alignment and not be favoring any particular country, to maintain good relations with China and others. The United States would not have this. Sihanouk's social programs, uplifting of the Cambodian people, general promotion of scholarly activity, promotion of Cambodian culture and university scholarship, and a general uplifting of the Cambodian people went against the throat-slitting Nazi-American white gangsters who deposed him in a military coup. Despite public revering this nationalist hero, the U.S. government did its standard butchery against the people in an attempt to murder as many and enslave as many Cambodians as possible. The March 18th coup of Sihanouk under the Nazi-American throat-slitting gangster Johnson, who, as we know, said, "Fuck you and your democracy" to all democratic leaders of third world countries, and whacked all of them good, as he was quoted as saying to diplomats in multiple sources. Sihanouk was very friendly to China, which the United States murderous throat-slitting Nazi white gangsters would not allow. They deposed him on March 18, 1967. Sihanouk found economic progress with Chinese influence to be far better for the Cambodian people than the fascist colonial enslavement state that the United States was pushing for. The CIA was intricately involved in this coup of Sihanouk, a standard theme throughout U.S. attempts at subversion of democracy and promotion of colonial fascism and butchery. New York Times Henry Kam, a capitalist media deceitful fraud and a deliberate white liar, described the contemptuousness for the Cambodian people because they were against Lon Nol and his anti-Vietnamese campaign, as well as the United States throat-slitting violence that they bring all over the world. It reflects the New York Times deceitful pro-American fraud media and deliberate lies to promote U.S. mass murder and genocide against the third world peoples of Southeast Asia. The United States promoted such instability in Cambodia through their military dictatorship and murder campaigns that a genocide was put forth, which was halted by a Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia after the U.S. withdrawal. It is another testament to American thug action in going somewhere, destroying the country with bombs and murder, and then another party has to come in and extricate the situation that Nazi throat-slitting white Americans created for the indigenous population. The amazing popular revulsion against the American invasion of Cambodia was due to its design to suppress peasant-based movements of national independence. Sihanouk refused to retire to France, and a Viet Cong-backed group was formed by the Vietnamese peasants to destroy the American presence in Cambodia. The NLF and Khmer Liberation Forces, as well as the Pathet Lao and the North Vietnamese, conducted a general Indochina war against the right-wing military dictatorship colonial fascist governments backed by the United States. The United States conducted a bombing campaign against Cambodia, resulting in a genocide of the Cambodian people. The United States fails to admit their mass murder in Cambodia, their their throat-slitting Nazi American white gangster military dictatorships and their grave repression of the people without paying any reparations or issuing any apologies. This is the general mark of this throat-slitting Nazi American white gangsters. So that's it. Glad you could join us. Again, grab the books from the discussion section. Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank. I'll be back tomorrow for chapter 4, which is on Laos. Glad you could join us. Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. Have a great day.